Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Harris. I am the Web Services and Distance Learning Librarian, and I have been part of the work group on accessible practices since 2016. And I'm going to be presenting today on different models of disability, different ways we view disability. And this actually came out of some research that I've been working on with other people in the accessibility group, and really kind of fell down a rabbit hole. And I think it's some really interesting information, so I'm glad to be able to share it. So today, the models I'm going to discuss are the religious or moral model of disability, the medical model of disability, the social model of disability, interactional models of disability, and the identity model of disability. Now, this is only a selection of them. When I was doing my research, I discovered there are quite a few different models of disability, but I think these are the big ones, and I'm going to discuss how some related models to these as I discuss each of them. After that, we will discuss higher education, basically the student experience of getting accommodations, and then we'll talk about how these models of disability are either seen or not seen in higher education. I did a very similar presentation for a group of librarians last month, and I estimate that it took me about 30 to 35 minutes to get through the basically the content here, and the rest of it, the time we spent in discussion. So just to give you guys an idea, we should have probably 15 or 20 minutes towards the end. One last note before I jump in, I'm going to use the acronym PWD in the slides because it stands for person or people with disabilities. Since that's kind of a long phrase and space on slides is limited, that's why I use that acronym. So if you see that, that's what that means. So the religious and moral model of disability is one of the older models. In the past, disability was viewed as a punishment. If it was something that a person was born with, the idea was that their parents or some ancestors further back sinned big time. And if the disability happens later in life, then it was the person with disabilities that sinned. Another way it was often viewed was that it was a test of faith. So if the disability went away, the person had passed this test of faith. And if it remained, they failed the test of faith, which is obviously kind of not an ideal way to look at disability. And then the other way that is commonly viewed is that disability is a gift. It's an opportunity for character development that people without disabilities don't experience. And this quote from Olkin, the last bullet, she said, if disability impairs one sense, it heightens another, often to mythic proportions. I can't read the quote because of the Zoom box. This image is legion in fiction, films, and medicine. And I'm curious, of those of you attending, how many of you have heard of the show Daredevil that was on Netflix? Okay, I see a couple of nods. If you're not familiar with that show or comic, it is basically, the idea is this guy got in a car crash when he was young, some toxic chemicals spilled into his eyes, and he was blinded, but his other senses were heightened, which is exactly the way Olkin describes. The other senses are heightened, often to mythic proportions, because he becomes the superhero. And it's very interesting. I was actually digging a little bit deeper into the show, and apparently religion is a theme throughout the entire show. But in the last episode, the main character the guy who's Daredevil, says, "I realized that if my life had turned out any differently, then I never would have become Daredevil. And although people have died on my watch, people who shouldn't have, there are countless others that have lived. So maybe it is all part of God's plan. Maybe my life has been exactly as it had to be." And to me, that fits in. That is like a perfect example of this whole disability as a gift concept. And that episode aired in 2018. So we're not talking like a super long time ago. So even though the religious and moral model of disability isn't the predominant one in the US right now, you can see it still very much in our media. So the main, and when I say main, the most popular, or I guess common model used today in the United States is the medical model, which is also called the biomedical model. This began to emerge in the mid-19th century. Around the same time, science was gaining traction and industrialization is happening. And under this model, disability is construed as something personal, where you have a solution that either sort of nullifies the issue. For example, hearing aids might completely solve an issue, hearing impairment. And if it's not something that quote unquote fixes it, it would be something that would lessen the effects of it. It would ameliorate the medical problem. This is the predominant view of disability in the US, and most disability laws are based on this model. And we'll get into that a little bit more later in the presentation. The weaknesses of this model, the first one, and this is unfortunately very common throughout different models of disability, is this idea that disabled bodies are inferior to able bodies. And I heard about this on social media and wanted to share this with you guys. This actually is just from yesterday, 19 hours ago. So the director of the CDC, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, what did she say? Here it is. The overwhelming number of deaths, over 75%, occurred in people who had at least 4 comorbidities. So really, these are people who were unwell to begin with. And yes, really encouraging news in the context of Omicron. And she got rightly criticized for that, because kind of implying, it's okay if people with, these comorbidities with disabilities, are the people who died, and, to me, it's just kind of, it's frustrating that she said that, but in some ways I'm like, thank you for giving me a perfect example of, this point that I'm trying to share with people. Some of the other flaws of this model is that it implies disabilities can be neatly defined and measured. I am the librarian that works primarily with the School of Education, and some of my colleagues work with other departments. And one class I work with usually every semester is a class on special education. And so the students learn about disabilities in that class. And I believe Carol Willard is here, and she has—
Thanks for the shout out.
Thank you. And she has taught that class, so she knows exactly what I'm talking about. And the primary law that has to do with special education is the, I think it's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I'm not sure if I got the full name correctly, but it's referred to as IDEA. And they have 13 categories of disability. And if you don't fit into one of these 13 categories, good luck to you. And one of the other weaknesses of the model is that it implies disabilities are rare. And I think this is a particularly pernicious aspect of this model. And again, I'll sort of refer to that as we go on in the presentation. But according to the CDC, actually 26% of adults in the US have a disability. So we're talking 1 in 4. And I do, as you can probably tell from this slide alone, I have a lot of sources, and the CDC source I'm mentioning is listed in the reference section, and I'll share my slides later. And the last weakness that I want to talk about is that this model totally ignores social and environmental barriers to people with disabilities. And that is a great segue into the next model, which is the social model of disability. This emerged in the UK in the 70s by a guy named Paul Hunt. And as I recall, Paul Hunt was disabled himself. I think he was living in an institution and didn't want to be living in an institution. He wanted to be independent. And that kind of desire is common, or was common, and sort of gave birth to this model. He helped form a group called the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. And since that specifically only mentions physical impairments, I do want to mention that the model, as discussed nowadays, has been expanded to include mental and cognitive impairments as well. The main idea of this model is that the impairments are different from the disability. The disability is caused by the social conditions, and that these social conditions have been designed in a way to exclude people with impairments. There's a big focus on self-determination and independence of people with disabilities. It's interesting, I think I've actually spoken with my mother and people she's known, and we've talked about how there's been this move towards greater self-advocacy in medicine. She talks about someone I knew as a child and how she just trusted everything the doctor said and just did whatever they said. And nowadays, I think there are a lot more people who are trying to educate themselves about what's out there with medical conditions that they may have. And for those people with disabilities and chronic illnesses, and of course there's some overlap there, they have lived experience that can be valuable information. So I'm not sure, but that could have, that sort of movement towards self-advocacy may have actually come out of this model of disability. So there are several models that are related to this. One of them is the socio-political or minority group model. And this was developed by Hahn. And there are 3 major points of this model. First, that the primary source of the problems confronted by people with disabilities can be traced to unfavorable attitudes about disabilities, that all aspects of the environment are shaped by public policy, and that policy tends to reflect social attitudes and values. And actually, there is some research that backs this up. This is in the reference section at the end. There's an article by Dirth and Branscombe, and they actually did find that negative attitudes toward people with disabilities do affect policy. So Hahn's observations have at least some evidence backing them up. Another model is the human variations or diversity model from Scotch and Schreiner. And they say that disability is just part of the natural physical, social, and cultural variability of the human race. And they didn't mention this, but one thing I've seen in various articles and things that I've read is that most people will experience disability in their life. It may be towards the end of life, maybe someone loses their hearing or their sight as they get older, but also people will experience temporary disabilities, like if they break their ankle slipping on ice, or break their arm or something of that sort. Scotch and Schreiner said that social institutions like medical offices, schools, etc., they may not currently have the ability to respond to this variability, but they have the potential, which is kind of a optimistic way of looking at things, which I don't think is seen in many of the other models. Another related model is the human rights model, and this was born out of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. And as related to the diversity model, you can see one of the things they argued is that disability is a natural part of human diversity, and that people with disability should have the same rights as everyone else, and that their impairment shouldn't be used as an excuse to deny or restrict rights. Excuse me. Next, we have the interactional models of disability. The functional model looks at the interaction between an individual, their disability, and the functions of that individual. The environmental model takes that a step further. They're looking at the same things, but also the environment. And Betty, I think is the name, made a comment that the more ability someone has to function within their environment, the less their disability is relevant. And that quote makes me think of a story that I'd like to tell you guys that I learned about. I just find it fascinating. There's this small town called Chilmark, and it's in Martha's Vineyard. And I believe Martha's Vineyard is an island off of Massachusetts. And around the mid to late 1600s, a congenitally deaf man emigrated from the UK to Chilmark. He had 2 children who were also congenitally deaf, and because it was a small, isolated town, that characteristic became very common in Chilmark. And as a result, they developed their own form of sign language that actually predated American Sign Language, and everyone in the community knew it. So you can imagine that these people who were deaf had a much greater ability to function within their environment because everyone was fluent in this Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. And I believe this lasted until the around 1900, and I'm not sure what sort of caused it to become less common again. But there's an article, I can't remember the author, but it's from The Atlantic, and that talks about this if you're interested, about Chilmark, and that's in the reference list. So the thing about these interactional models realizes that each person has different required functions based on their interests, their aptitudes, and so forth, and that each environment is going to be different as well. Again, like many of the other disability models we've looked at, disability is still seen as a drawback, as something that limits people's functionality. So one of the related models to this is the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, often referred to as the ICF model, or the biopsychosocial model. And this was developed by the World Health Organization. And basically, you know, it is related to the interactional models. You know, it's looking at the people, their functions, their impairments, their specific activities, which I guess you could say is another type of function, and the environmental factors. So it's most similar to the environmental model, but it's just a little bit more specific. And then the last model we're going to discuss is the identity or cultural affiliation model of disability. So basically, the point of this model is it's more focused on finding kinship with other people who have that lived experience of disability. And this is very common. There's this concept, if you haven't heard of it, called affinity grouping. And basically, it's common for when people who share a specific lived experience that's hard to really understand unless you have that experience. So just for some examples, I'll use myself. I have experience with sexism as a woman, and so I would say probably men in general don't understand that lived experience, even though they may be sympathetic to it. And similarly, I don't know what it's like to have the lived experience of a person of color. You know, again, I can sympathize, I can educate myself, but I cannot feel what those people have experienced. So that's kind of the idea underlying this model of disability. It's less focused on change and really more interested in forming this positive definition. And one thing I wanted to comment on is that you may see the phrase person or people with disabilities, like I've been using, and that's what is called a person first language, but some people actually do prefer to be called a disabled person, where the emphasis is on their identity as a disabled person rather than on their personhood. So the real weakness of this model is just that it's less interested in change, which is not a huge weakness in my opinion. So let's move on to talking about higher education and disability. So in higher education, this experience of students with disabilities is very, very different from what they experience in a K-12 environment. And hopefully I won't say anything wrong here, but Carol, please jump in if I am missing any details. But basically, in the K-12 realm, students, there's usually a team involved in helping the student within their educational environment. There are plans, and I don't remember the difference between these, but there's the IEP, which is the individualized education plan, and then a 504 plan. Like I said, I'm not sure of the difference, but again, this is a sort of a team effort where parents are involved, teachers, maybe counselors if it's relevant. You know, perhaps a person has an emotional disturbance. If someone had a speech impediment, maybe a speech therapist would be part of that team. So the student has a lot of support there. But once they get to college, they have to self-disclose to the Disability Services Office in order to get accommodations. The students often have to re-register each semester, and they have to provide medical documentation of the disability. And I think it's pretty clear if they have to provide this medical documentation, there's some reliance on the medical model here. I also wanted to touch briefly on the experience of faculty and staff with disabilities. And I can say this from my own experience. I am hearing impaired myself. There's usually no specific guidelines or resources for faculty and staff with disabilities. If you search for information, it's often going to be more focused on how you can accommodate disabled students in your class. And instead of having like a page with resources, it's just kind of, yeah, talk to HR about whatever accommodations you need. It's even more vague than what students experience. And to me, that reflects, again, this kind of idea of disability being a rarity, but chances are, you know, 26% of adults have a disability. So how many faculty and staff would have disabilities? Is it 1 in 4? Is it less because maybe we make it more difficult for people with disabilities to become faculty and staff? You know, as we know, most faculty have some advanced degree, and we may make that more difficult for students to get to that point. Sorry, I'm on the wrong page here. So in my mind, the medical model is the one that is most present in higher education. It's perceived as a personal problem, which again goes right back to the idea of the medical model. And there's this wonderful book called Academic Ableism that just kind of blew my mind, but it talked extensively about disability and higher education. And it was actually recommended to me by Nazli Kirkjian, who was the former sort of head of accessibility services for SUNY. She's now at Potsdam. But she recommended this book to me. It is freely available. It's an open access book, so you can download it for free. And again, that is in the reference list. But there was this passage that really caught my eye in the book. And I guess the student was talking to the author and said that the accommodation process is kind of like Battleship. You don't know what's on the other side. You don't know what the other person's board looks like. So you are just kind of guessing, like hoping you hit the battleship or the submarine or the destroyer or whatever the boat is. And trying to figure out what the accommodations are. So you can just sort of throw your diagnosis over and hope that it will land on something. And so that's a student describing their own experience, which sounds very frustrating. And again, we encounter this myth of rarity. I know that the accessibility group, work group that I am part of, we talked about this whole concept. And we definitely, I never personally heard anyone say, but there are no disabled students in my class. But I definitely got that impression that that sentiment had been expressed on campus. And again, we have the 26% average from the CDC for adults, but and unfortunately 2015, 2016 is the most recent data from the National Center for Education Statistics. But according to those statistics, 19.4, so almost 1 in 5 students reported having a disability. So again, given I think our average class size is around 19, the likelihood of no students in your class having a disability is very low. There's probably going to be a student with a disability in your class at one point. So the other model that I really see in higher education is Hahn's minority group model. He said people have these unfavorable attitudes. And there has been research that has shown that students are reluctant to disclose their disability. The Giordowski article is actually from EDUCAUSE. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with EDUCAUSE as a pretty reputable source in general. Lyman et al. Identified 6 different themes on why students choose not to disclose their disability status. One is a desire for self-sufficiency. And actually, the Newman article, they actually found that several students didn't disclose because they believed they did not have a disability by the time they finished high school. So this may mean that maybe they have a disability, like a learning disability, and they feel they've developed all the strategies they need. So I don't know how much it's actually they believe they've been cured. The other themes are a desire to avoid negative social reactions, insufficient knowledge of what accommodations are available, the quality and usefulness of DSS, which is disability support services, and the accommodations that they may have gotten in the past, negative experiences with professors, and fear of future ramifications. And again, the things that I bolded sort of tie back to this idea of unfavorable attitudes. These students are afraid of dealing with others' unfavorable attitudes. There was, in my mind, a kind of horrifying story. This is in that Academic Ableism book. And there was a story about a professor who basically decided to completely ignore what the student was requesting and what the Office of, the Disability Services Office had suggested as an accommodation, and said, this is what I'm going to offer you. Totally ignored the people with the lived experience of the disability and the people with experience supporting students with disabilities. And to me, it's just kind of horrifying that someone thought that they knew better than those two groups. And I also wanted to mention the interactional models because in my mind, they are notably absent in higher education. There was an article, and I believe this was from an article in Inside Higher Ed, but there was a medical student named Harry Paul, and he said, accommodations do not often take care of accommodating people off campus. You can have someone to help you get to class, but if you can't get your groceries, how can you stay in school? And I really think disability services offices in general are really focused on that one function, the student function, the academic function, not about the other things. And considering still the majority of colleges are residential colleges, I think that's kind of a glaring error. And I was wrong, I actually have one more model to discuss, the diversity model. So there's this concept of ableist exceptionalism, and this is the idea that someone, may be supportive of social justice in general, but for some reason that's not transferring over mentally into the area of disability and ableism. And that quote there that I have about using the words moron and idiot kind of made me wince because I've certainly used those terms recently. And yet I think it is a very good point. Those ideas came out of this ableist point of view, and we should probably not be using them in common conversation. Another interesting thing is that disability is often excluded from institutional discussions of DEI. There was a study in 2020 that found that less than 25% of campus diversity statements actually discuss disability. And this is unfortunately very similar in other industries as well. In the reference list, there is a group called Return on Disability, and they looked at a bunch of different sectors and found, again, a very similar statistic. I think it was about 20% or 25% mentioned disability in their statements about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that sort of exceptionalism where we're thinking we're social justice minded, but not when it comes to disability is very common. And I think it's something we need to address. So I am pretty much right on schedule. This is the end of my presentation or the presentation part. And I would love to hear your questions, your observations, and I have several questions for discussion that you can chime in on, but those are just suggestions. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. I'm going to make a totally unrelated comment and say, Michael, that is a very cute baby. Carol, your box is showing up as highlighted for me. Did you have anything you wanted to comment on?
No, I think you did a nice job with the historical overview. I think, there is a shift from K-12 education and higher ed, and it's a shift both for the person who needs support and for instructors in K-12 settings versus higher ed settings. They don't, it's not the same. And this notion that of having to self-disclose, I think, can really impact the services that students want to use. And instructors at the college level aren't necessarily prepared in the same ways that K-12 instructors are prepared. And so the notion of supporting a range of learners is maybe unfamiliar to higher ed people.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's something we've certainly been working on here at Oswego. I think many of you are aware that we have an Accessibility Fellows program for faculty, and Carol is a former fellow. And I believe we're also looking at expanding, or I know we are looking at expanding it to staff as well. And overall, the work group on accessible practices has been working to sort of try to offer that education on how to create accessible materials. There's this concept that accessibility is planning for it, planning to have some learning materials or whatever, any kind of content accessible from the first place so that accommodations aren't needed. And then accommodations are kind of fixing it after the fact. And so a lot of what we have done is focusing on helping people create stuff that's accessible from the start. And I'll just put in a plug. We have a lot of breakout sessions this week and I think next week on how to do stuff related to accessibility. So I hope you will attend those. I think the thing that really sticks out for me as a librarian is, I don't have the kind of relationship teaching faculty have with their students. They work with the students the entire semester. They often will have students in multiple classes. And, I don't get a chance to have that sort of develop a close relationship with students. And I personally don't supervise any student workers, so I don't have that chance either. And we also never get any sort of notification of students with disabilities. If someone, I believe professors will get some sort of notification that someone in their class needs accommodations. Or I know at least that if there's content that needs to be fixed because it's inaccessible, I believe that the faculty members contacted about that at least. So I feel like faculty in some ways have a little bit more, I don't know if warning is the right word, but I feel like the library and probably a lot of other support services on campus, like career services and experiential learning, we really have to buy into that idea of creating accessibly from the start, because we don't know coming in, who the people coming in to our offices or the library are disabled. So we just have to sort of plan based on that assumption, based on those facts that we know probably 1 to 4, 1 to 5 people walking into our office or building do have a disability. So I'd love to know if anybody has any sort of thoughts on that, on how we can sort of broaden our approach to the services and support that we offer.
I don't want to monopolize with all my comments, but I just would say, add to that too, Laura, that's why I think talking about the framework, right, the historical perspective of how we view disability and helping people to have a mindset that disability isn't the onus of responsibility isn't on the person with the disability, but it's really about creating an atmosphere where everybody can have accessibility to what we're offering. So it's not just, it could be, I don't have a documented disability that I get an accommodation officially through accessibility services, but I might, be having a busy day. So I need to have my textbook chapters available through an audiobook because I'm doing, I don't know, I have a job as a dog walker or something. I don't know, you know what I mean? Like, so it's just, I think it's important to think about accessibility in terms of our own reference to what ability and disability is. Yeah. And I'd be interested if anybody has any other thoughts about that, or has shifted their thinking about what disability is, or the framework for thinking about differences?
I was gonna say, basically attending these sessions and like participating in the accessibility challenge to put it on ourselves to just create more inclusive atmospheres that are conducive to student success. So I know like one specific way I've adjusted or adapted is being more direct, right? It's not on the student to get the social cues. We can be direct in our everyday language and just creating atmospheres that are supportive. And, you know, you can tweak a lot of different things in these sessions, even touch on like the colors being accessible in an advertisement. So I guess there's just a lot of different angles to educate ourselves and be proactive in our approach.
You know, one thing that Carol mentioned that I wanted to add to is that if you are designing accessibility from the start, it's often going to lead to innovation. You can see I'm wearing Apple AirPods right now, and Apple is actually, a lot of the stuff that we use every day has sort of come out of Apple designing for people with disabilities. So like Siri, you know, a lot of us use Siri, and that was, I believe, originally designed for, you know, someone with visual impairments. So if you're thinking that expansively, you're going to find that things you create with for people with disabilities can be just sort of eye-opening and useful for a wide variety of people. And another thing Carol mentioned, and I sort of mentioned too, is this kind of idea of a mismatch with the environment. Like if you're a dog walker and needing to listen to audio because you can't read while you're walking dogs, you know, read visually, that even people who aren't necessarily disabled or even have like a temporary disability like a broken arm will benefit. I mean, when you think about automatically opening doors, like at grocery stores, you can probably imagine someone, you know, holding a child and, you know, trying to juggle, you know, purse or diaper bag. That's going to be really helpful for that person. They don't have a disability. They don't have use of their arm because they have a baby in it. And just different things like that. You know, one of the other things I'm thinking about is audio being available for, and Michael having that baby made me think of one of my favorite examples. You know, what if you have a baby who's, you know, very fussy, maybe they're teething, you know, and they're only falling asleep on you and you can't like listen to something, you know, or watch a video. But if you can put on captions, you can still do that, you know, whether it's for your work or school or whatever, without disturbing the baby. And again, that's not a disability, but it's something where accommodations can really, or accessible design can really make things easier in a variety of circumstances. Anyone else have any observations or thoughts on anything we've mentioned or any of the questions?
This is just something brief, but I wanted to let you know that it was in regard to one of the last points in the presentation. I'm not ashamed to admit that I came to accessibility through my work in DEI because I work in anthropology and Native American studies here. So at least for me at the 1 foot level, it did work. The arrows are going both ways. At least here right now.
Cool. We do still have a few more minutes, not a lot, but I don't think anyone has anything else to add. Actually, let me look at the chat and see if there's anything there. Yes, I'm glad someone mentioned this. The idea of universal design. And Karen provided an excellent link on what universal design is. But as I understand it, the basic idea is, designing from the start in a way that's going to make sense to students in a wide variety of, presenting the information in a variety of ways, assessing, learning in a variety of ways. I am specifically talking about universal design for learning, which is kind of a branch of universal design. And let me stop my presentation. So this is a great site on universal design for learning specifically. So between the link that Karen shared and the link that I shared, hopefully that can give you some information on it. And just to see what Carol added, she said, students with an IEP are entitled to specialized instruction and special education services. They're only applicable in K-12 settings. Students with a 504 plan don't receive special education services, but do get accommodations in the general education classroom. And those are applicable across lifespan, which I did not know. So thank you, Carol.
Yeah, IEPs are only a K-12 thing. There's no IEPs in higher ed.
Mm-hmm.